Before the Viking longships ever cut across the waves, before warriors carried axes into distant lands, the people of the North had stories. These stories were not merely tales, they were the fabric of their world, shaping how they saw life, death, and everything beyond. To understand the Vikings, we must begin not with swords and ships, but with the gods, myths, and legends that gave them their courage and their fate. In the far north, where winters are long and the night seems endless, people gazed at the stars and wondered. They told of a vast world tree called Yggdrasil, whose roots stretched deep into hidden realms and whose branches held up the heavens. At its base, coiled the serpent Nidhogg, gnawing at the roots, while eagles soared above its crown. Around this tree were the 9 worlds, the realms of gods, giants, men, and spirits, all connected in a web of fate. At the heart of these tales was Odin, the All-Father. He was not a simple god of light or goodness, but a complex figure, wise, restless, and ever seeking knowledge. Odin had given one of his eyes for wisdom, drinking from the well of Mimir, and he hung upon Yggdrasil for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, to gain the secrets of the runes. The Vikings revered him as a god of war and poetry, of kingship and sorcery. Imagine him cloaked in shadow, wandering the world in disguise, seeking truths hidden from mortals. Beside him was Thor, the Thunderer, strong and fierce, protector of mankind. With his mighty hammer, Mjolnir, he fought giants and monsters, keeping chaos at bay. His temper was quick, but his heart was steady, and the people of the North prayed to him for safety, for good harvests, and for strength in battle. Picture him as you fall into rest, red-bearded storm clouds gathering at his call, lightning crackling in his hammer's swing. Then there was Loki, the trickster. Neither holy friend nor holy enemy to the gods, he brought both mischief and ruin. Clever, sly, and unpredictable, Loki's schemes often caused disaster, yet he also helped solve the problems he created. In him the Vikings saw the chaos of the world, the way fate could twist suddenly, the way fortune could turn to ruin in a heartbeat. Other gods and goddesses filled the pantheon. Freya, radiant goddess of love, beauty, and war, who received half of the slain in her hall, while Odin took the other half to Valhalla. Frey, her brother, god of fertility and prosperity, who brought peace and plenty. Tyr, the one-handed god of honor, who had sacrificed his hand to bind the wolf Fenrir. Frigg, Odin's wife, wise in prophecy. Each deity embodied some part of life's struggle, love and loss, war and harvest, courage and sacrifice. The Norse people lived close to the edge of survival. Harsh winters, scarce farmland, and violent seas defined their lives. Their myths reflected this reality. They believed the world itself would one day end in Ragnarok, a final battle when the gods would fight the giants, the sun and moon would be devoured, and the seas would swallow the land. Even Odin and Thor were fated to fall, but from the ashes, a new world would rise, green and fertile once more. This vision of fate, harsh yet hopeful, guided them. To live bravely, to die with honor, was to play one's part in this cosmic cycle. Imagine a Viking longhouse in the dark of winter. The fire crackles, smoke curling to the rafters. Families gather close, wrapped in furs, while a skald, a poet and storyteller, recites these sagas. His voice rises and falls, painting pictures of gods and giants, of battles fought in realms beyond sight. Children listen wide-eyed, while warriors nod silently, knowing that their lives echo these myths. In the crackle of the fire and the rhythm of the words, the people of the North felt themselves part of something greater than their small villages or fleeting days. For the Vikings, myth and history blended seamlessly. When they sailed into unknown seas, they carried Thor's hammer as a talisman. When they faced battle, they believed Odin's Valkyries hovered above, ready to carry the brave to Valhalla. When storms raged, they muttered prayers to Njord, god of the sea. The gods were not distant abstractions, but companions in daily life, reflections of the struggles and triumphs of ordinary people. These myths also gave the Vikings their fierce courage. To die in battle was not a tragedy, but an honor. Death was not an end, but a passage, to feast in Valhalla or dwell in Freya's hall. This belief made them fearless, ready to risk everything on distant voyages, to face overwhelming odds with laughter on their lips. Imagine the terror their enemies must have felt, warriors who fought as though death itself were a gift. As you drift towards sleep, envision Yggdrasil stretching above you, its branches heavy with stars, its roots deep in shadow. Picture Odin wandering in the night, seeking secrets. Imagine Thor's hammer crackling in the sky, Loki's sly grin flashing in the firelight, Freya's beauty shining like dawn. These were the companions of the Viking soul, gods as flawed and mighty as the people themselves. This was the world the Vikings were born into, a world shaped not just by fjords and storms, but by sagas that told them who they were, where they came from, and where they were destined to go. Before the first longship sailed, before the first monastery burned, the Vikings carried these myths in their hearts. And as they set out into the seas, those stories would sail with them, guiding their courage, shaping their destiny. Far from the bustling courts of kings or the crowded markets of the south, the Vikings were shaped by their homeland, the rugged landscapes of Scandinavia. Long before they became raiders and voyagers, they were farmers, fishermen, and herders, carving out survival in a land both beautiful and unforgiving. To understand their spirit, we must walk through their villages, breathe the icy air of the fjords, and feel the rhythm of their daily lives. Scandinavia was a land of extremes. Towering mountains rose above narrow valleys. Deep fjords carved the coastline, their dark waters reaching inland like fingers of the sea. Forests stretched endlessly, home to elk, wolves, and bears. And winters were long and harsh, when snow buried the fields and the sun barely rose above the horizon. Summers were short but vibrant, the days so long that the sky glowed even at midnight. It was a land that demanded resilience, and the people who lived there became as tough as the granite beneath their feet. Most Vikings were not warriors at all, but farmers. Their fields were small, cut from the rocky soil. They grew barley, rye, oats, and turnips, crops that could withstand the cold. They kept cattle, sheep, and goats for milk and wool, and pigs for meat. In summer, they gathered hay to feed their animals through the winter. Every task mattered, for a poor harvest could mean hunger when the snow came. Farming was not only labor, but also community. Villages worked together to clear land, build fences, and share tools. Families lived in longhouses, great wooden halls with walls of timber and turf. A single fire burned at the center, its smoke curling up to the roof, filling the air with warmth and the smell of wood. Here, family and servants, animals and children, all shared the same space. The crackle of the fire was constant, and its glow bound the family together through the long, dark nights. Life in these halls was full of rhythm. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and tended the home. Men repaired tools, carved wood, and planned the next season's work. Children herded animals, fetched water, and listened to the sagas told by elders. In the evenings, the hall came alive with laughter, music, and story. Skalds recited poems of gods and heroes, and the people found both entertainment and wisdom in their words. Beyond the fields and longhouses lay the sea. The Northmen were fishermen and sailors long before they became conquerors. They fished cod, herring, and salmon, preserving them with salt or smoke to last through the year. They hunted seals and whales along the coasts and gathered eiderdown, the soft feathers prized for warmth. The sea was both friend and foe. It gave food and passage, but storms could claim ships without warning. To the Vikings, the sea was alive, a force to be respected and feared, and they prayed to Njord, god of wind and waves, to carry them safely. Though their world seemed remote, the Vikings were not isolated. They traded with neighboring tribes, bartered furs, amber, and iron for goods they could not produce themselves. Amber, golden and smooth, was gathered along the Baltic coast and prized as far away as the Mediterranean. Iron, smelted in small furnaces from bog ore, provided weapons and tools. In exchange, they sought salt, grain, and luxury items, hints of the wider world that lay beyond their mountains and seas. Religion was woven into every part of life. A farmer might sacrifice a goat to Frey for good harvests, or offer ale to Thor for protection. Sacred groves and standing stones dotted the land, places where the gods were believed to dwell. Festivals marked the turning of the seasons, midwinter feasts to survive the darkness, midsummer celebrations to honor the sun. These rituals bound the community together, reminding them that their struggles were part of a greater order, watched over by gods both stern and generous. Imagine now the sounds of a Viking village, the creak of wagon wheels as firewood is hauled, the bleating of goats and the bark of dogs, the ring of an axe splitting logs, laughter from the longhouse as children chase one another, and above it all, the cries of seabirds circling the fjord, a reminder that beyond the mountains lay the open sea, calling to those bold enough to follow it. While survival demanded hard work, there was also joy. In summer, families gathered for feasts and weddings, sharing roasted meat and honey-sweetened mead. Games were played, from simple board games like Hnefatafl to contests of strength and skill. Wrestling matches tested young men, while music and dance lifted spirits. Even in the harshest lands, the Vikings found reason to celebrate, for joy was as necessary as bread. It was in these villages that the Viking spirit was forged, a spirit both communal and restless. The long winters taught patience, but the endless horizon of the sea inspired curiosity. A child listens, wide-eyed as an elder speaks of Odin and Thor, of distant lands and untold treasures. Outside, the sea crashes against the rocks, whispering promises of journeys yet to come. This was life in the Northlands, simple, harsh, and beautiful. From these homes came the men and women who would sail farther than anyone before them, who would carve their names into the shores of Britain, France, Russia, and even the distant New World. But before they set sail, they learned resilience, community, and faith. Lessons born of the soil and the sea, lessons that would carry them across the world. If the harsh land of Scandinavia shaped the Viking spirit, then the longship gave it wings. Without this marvel of wood and sail, the sagas of raids, voyages, and distant colonies would never have been told. More than a vessel, the longship was a symbol of freedom, of power, of adventure. It carried farmers beyond their fields, warriors beyond their fjords, and explorers to the very edge of the known world. The longship was unlike any vessel the world had seen. Its design was simple yet ingenious. Narrow, sleek, and graceful, it could glide across open seas or slip silently up shallow rivers. Its keel was shallow, allowing it to beach directly on a shore, where warriors could leap out, swords and axes in hand. A dragon's head often adorned its prow, carved in fierce detail, meant to terrify enemies and ward off evil spirits. To watch one approach was to feel awe and fear. Crafted from oak, pine, and ash, the longship was built to be both strong and flexible. The planks were overlapped in the clinker style, fastened with iron rivets, giving the hull resilience against waves. At its heart stood a single mast with a square sail, often striped in red and white, billowing in the wind. When the sea was calm or the wind unkind, the oars came into play, as many as 30 or more, pulled by warriors whose rhythm turned sweat into speed. But perhaps the greatest genius of the longship was its balance. Light enough to be carried across land if need be, yet sturdy enough to cross oceans, it made the Vikings as mobile as the wind. Rivers that once guarded kingdoms became highways. Coastlines that had seemed secure became vulnerable. No monastery, no city, no shore was safe once the dragon prows appeared on the horizon. Yet the longship was not only an instrument of war, it was also a vessel of discovery. In these ships, the Vikings sailed to Iceland, Greenland, and even Vinland in North America. They followed the stars, the flight of seabirds, the smell of the sea, and the play of light on the water. With only sunstones and keen eyes to guide them, they reached farther than any before them. The longship was the key that unlocked the world. Imagine standing on the deck of such a ship. The sea stretches endless in every direction, the waves rising and falling like mountains of water. The sail snaps in the wind, and the timbers groan as the ship surges forward. Around you men grip their oars, their breath steady, their eyes fixed on the horizon. At the prow, the carved dragon glares ahead, as if daring the sea to resist. There is fear, yes, but also exhilaration. For with this ship the world is open, and every coastline a possibility. The longship was also a gathering place, a floating hall. Warriors slept beside their shields, ate from shared bowls, and sang to keep the rhythm of the oars. Songs of Odin's halls, of Thor's battles, of journeys yet to come echoed across the waves. Each voyage was not only a raid or a trade, but a story woven into the fabric of the sagas. There were many types of ships. The Drakar, or dragon ship, long and slender, built for speed and terror, carried raiders across seas and rivers alike. The Nar, broader and sturdier, carried traders and settlers, their holds filled with goods, animals and families. Each vessel had its place, but all carried the same spirit, the daring to go farther, to risk more, to see what lay beyond the next horizon. For the Vikings, the longship was more than wood and sail. It was freedom. It meant that a farmer in a small fjord could dream of silver from an English monastery, or land across the sea in Iceland. It meant that no kingdom, however mighty, could feel secure. It meant that a people from the cold edges of the world could stride onto the stage of history and leave a mark across continents. Think now of a quiet bay at dawn. The mist rises from the water soft and pale. Along the shore longships rest, their prows carved with dragons and serpents, their hulls glistening with dew. Warriors step aboard, tightening their cloaks, adjusting their swords. The sail is raised, the oars dip into the water, and slowly the ships glide into the mist. Within hours they will be at sea, and within days perhaps striking a distant shore. To those who await them, they are terror. To those who sail them, they are destiny. Even in death, the longship held meaning. For some great chieftains and kings, ships were used as tombs, buried with weapons, treasures, and offerings. These ship burials symbolized the journey into the afterlife, carrying the soul across unknown waters to the halls of the gods. The ship was not only a tool for this world, but a vessel for the next, a bridge between mortal life and eternal saga. As you drift deeper into sleep, picture a Viking longship cutting across silver waves. The wind filling its sail, the sea spray cool upon your face. Hear the creak of timbers, the steady beat of oars, the distant cry of gulls. The ship carries you forward, not just across the sea, but across time, to raids and voyages, to discoveries and legends, to the heart of the Viking story. The longship was their key, their weapon, their home, and their legacy. With it, they unlocked the world, and with it, they would carve their names into history. The longship had given the Vikings wings, and soon those wings carried them far from their fjords and fields. At first they set out for trade, for testing the waters of distant coasts, for small ventures of risk and return. But in time, their sails carried a new kind of mission, one that would etch terror into the hearts of kingdoms across Europe. These were the first Viking raids, sudden storms upon shores unprepared, and they marked the beginning of an age. It was the summer of 793 CE when the world first truly took notice. Off the coast of Northumbria, in the cold waters of the North Sea, a fleet of longships appeared, their dragon prows cutting through the waves. They made landfall on a small island called Lindisfarne, home to a monastery that had stood quietly for generations. Here monks prayed, copied manuscripts, and tended their holy shrine. The island seemed safe, far from wars and turmoil. But the Northmen came with axes and fire. They fell upon the monastery with speed and fury. The monks were slaughtered or carried away as captives. Treasures of silver, gold, and jeweled reliquaries were stripped from the altars. The holy place was desecrated, its walls broken, its sanctity destroyed. Word of the raid spread quickly, carried by survivors and neighboring kingdoms. To many it seemed as if demons had risen from the sea. In truth, it was the beginning of the Viking Age. Why monasteries? Because they were rich and vulnerable. In those days, churches and monasteries were storehouses of wealth, filled with silver chalices, jeweled crosses, and offerings from the faithful. They were often isolated, their guardians monks rather than warriors. To Viking eyes they were perfect targets, treasures waiting to be claimed. And so, again and again, Viking ships struck, not only in Britain, but also along the coasts of Ireland and Francia. The raids were shocking, not only for their violence, but for their suddenness. No warning preceded them, no armies marched in advance. One moment the shore was quiet. The next, long ships appeared, and warriors spilled onto the land. The monks of Iona, the abbeys of Ireland, the river towns of Francia, all learned the same lesson. Nowhere near the sea was safe. Yet these raids were more than simple plunder. They were also born of necessity. Life in Scandinavia was hard, and wealth was scarce. Silver, so vital for trade, was rare in the north. By raiding, Vikings gained the silver and goods they needed to barter for luxuries and essentials alike. Raiding was also a path to glory. A young warrior could win fame and wealth, rising in honor among his peers. To raid was to test oneself against fate, to carve one's name into memory. Imagine, if you will, a coastal village at dawn, the sun just rising, fishermen preparing their nets, children playing along the shore. Suddenly, the cry goes up, sails on the horizon. The dragon-headed ships draw closer, their oars cutting the sea. Panic spreads. Some flee inland, others grasp weapons, but the raiders are swift. Within moments, fire rises, silver is seized and captives are bound. Then, as quickly as they came, the ships are gone, vanishing into the waves, leaving only smoke and sorrow behind. The raids were not random chaos. They required skill, organization, and courage. Crews of 30, 40 or more worked in unison, their ships steered with precision. Scouts chose targets, and leaders guided the attack. Sometimes they returned to the same places year after year, demanding tribute in exchange for peace. In this way, the raids evolved into something more, into a strategy of dominance. By the end of the 8th century and into the 9th, the raids expanded. Ireland's coasts became hunting grounds. In Francia, the great rivers, the Seine, the Loire, became Viking highways, carrying ships deep inland. Paris itself was threatened, its churches and markets trembling at the sight of dragon prows. Kingdoms struggled to defend themselves, raising armies too slow to catch the swift ships. Kings paid silver, the Danegeld, to buy peace, though peace rarely lasted long. To their victims, the Vikings seemed a plague, merciless and godless. To the Vikings themselves, it was simply survival and opportunity. Each raid brought wealth to their homelands, wealth that built alliances, bought land, and secured power. Young men returned with silver, with slaves, with tales of distant lands, and each successful raid inspired the next, carrying the Northmen farther and farther from their shores. But even in these early years, there was more than raiding. Alongside the warriors came traders, eager to barter furs, amber, and iron for foreign goods. Alongside destruction came settlement, as Vikings lingered on coasts and founded new homes. Dublin in Ireland began as a Viking camp. York in England would soon fall under Norse control. These first raids were the spark, but soon the flame would grow into something larger, kingdoms carved out by the Sea Kings. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine the fear and wonder of those days. Picture a quiet monastery, its bells ringing in the morning air, suddenly silenced by the clash of steel. Imagine the longships vanishing into the mist, leaving the survivors to tell of demons with axes and fire. But also imagine the Vikings returning home, their ships heavy with treasure, their hearts proud, their sagas enriched with tales of daring. The first raids were not yet empire, not yet conquest. They were sparks, sudden, violent, unforgettable, sparks that would ignite the Viking Age, carrying the Northmen from the fjords of Norway to the farthest edges of the known world. The first raids had shaken Europe, sending shockwaves through monasteries and kingdoms alike. But the Vikings were never only raiders. The same longships that carried warriors with axes could also carry families, animals, and tools. What began as lightning strikes soon grew into something deeper. The Vikings became not just plunderers, but settlers, planting their roots in foreign soil and shaping new societies. After the raids on Britain, Ireland, and Francia, some Vikings began to linger. At first they built winter camps, small fortified bases where they could wait for the spring thaw before launching raids again. But soon these camps became permanent. Along rivers and coasts they built homes, markets and walls. The line between raider and resident blurred. One of the earliest and most famous of these settlements was Dublin in Ireland. Founded in the mid-9th century, it began as a Viking stronghold on the River Liffey. At first, it was little more than a fort and harbour, but it grew swiftly into a bustling town. From Dublin, the Norse launched raids deep into Ireland, but they also traded. Silver from the Middle East, silks from Byzantium, and furs from the north all passed through its markets. In time, Dublin became one of the most important Viking cities, a hub of both war and commerce. In England too, the Vikings established strongholds. Yorkant, or Jorvik as they called it, became the jewel of Norse England. Its streets filled with craftsmen, traders and warriors, its markets alive with goods from across the seas. The smell of smoke and ironwork mingled with the salt of the river, and the sound of many tongues, Old Norse, Old English and beyond, created a tapestry of cultures. Jorvik was no longer only English or only Norse. It was both, and something new besides. As settlers, the Vikings adapted. Though they brought their own language and customs, they also blended with the local people. Marriages between Norsemen and local women were common, producing children who carried both heritages. These Norse Gaels, especially in Ireland and Scotland, embodied the fusion of cultures. They spoke languages that mixed Norse and Gaelic, worshipped both old gods and the new Christ, and forged identities that could not be easily separated. But the settlements were not only about blending, they were also about power. Vikings seized fertile lands, established their own rulers, and demanded tribute from surrounding communities. Sometimes they ruled as conquerors, other times they became lords among lords, fitting into the patchwork of medieval kingdoms. In both cases, they left a mark that endured. Imagine walking through a Viking settlement. At the harbour, longships bob in the tide, their sails furled, their hulls heavy with goods. Traders haggle over silver coins and bolts of cloth. Children run between wooden houses, their laughter mixing with the clang of blacksmiths at their forges. Smoke curls from the hearths, carrying the smell of roasting meat. At the hall of a local jarl, warriors gather to boast of raids, while scribes record agreements of land and trade. This is not the chaos of a raid, but the rhythm of a community, growing, thriving, rooted. The settlements also became gateways of exchange. The Vikings brought with them not only weapons, but also art, technology, and ideas. Their shipbuilding techniques influenced coastal peoples. Their jewelry, carved in intricate knotwork, blended with local styles. Their stories, sung by skalds, mingled with native legends, creating shared mythologies. At the same time, the Vikings absorbed much from those around them: Christianity, new farming methods, and systems of law. Ireland bore this mark strongly. Though the Irish fought fiercely against the invaders, the Norse presence transformed the island. Towns like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick became centres of trade that outlived Viking rule. The Norse brought urban life to lands that had been largely rural, reshaping Ireland's future. In England, the settlements laid the groundwork for the Danelaw, vast regions where Norse law and custom prevailed. Here, Old Norse words seeped into the English tongue. Words like sky, egg, and knife still spoken today. The Vikings may have been feared invaders, but their legacy became woven into daily life, as natural as the changing seasons. Of course, not all welcomed them. Wars erupted again and again between Viking settlers and native kings. In England, Alfred the Great of Wessex resisted fiercely, building fortresses and pushing back against Norse advances. In Ireland, clans rose against Viking cities, sometimes defeating them, sometimes making uneasy alliances. The Vikings were never uncontested, but they endured, adapting when they could not conquer outright. Think of the courage, or perhaps the desperation, it took to settle in these distant lands, to leave behind the safety of home and carve out a new life in hostile territory, to face not only the wrath of local rulers, but also the unforgiving winters and the uncertainty of survival. Yet the Vikings did it again and again, turning foreign soil into home. As you drift toward sleep, imagine a Viking family arriving on distant shores. The father hauls timbers from the ship to build a new home. The mother spreads furs across the floor of their longhouse, making warmth for the children. The children chase one another by the riverbank, their laughter mingling with the strange new sounds of foreign tongues. Around them, warriors sharpen blades, traders weigh silver, priests bless shrines. Slowly, a settlement grows rooted in courage, hardened by struggle destined to endure. These settlers were not so different from the raiders who struck Lindisfarne, but their vision was longer. They sought not only treasure, but also belonging. And in doing so, they transformed not only themselves, but also the lands they touched. From raiders to colonizers, the Vikings were writing a new chapter, one where fire gave way to hearth, and the sea became not only a path to plunder, but a bridge to new homes. The Vikings who settled in Ireland, England, and beyond had begun to plant their roots. Yet the heart of their story still beat with the rhythm of battle drums, the clash of steel, and the daring of legendary warriors. For though they built towns and traded goods, it was the sagas of kings and champions that carried their names across the centuries. The age of raiders had grown into the age of leaders, men whose courage and cunning transformed loose bands of warriors into armies and proto-kingdoms. Among the most famous of these figures was Ragnar Lothbrok, a man of both history and legend. The sagas tell us he was a warrior of unmatched daring who fought dragons and sailed farther than any other. He wore trousers of rough wool, tarred for protection, Lothbrok meaning hairy breeches. Whether he was one man or a blend of many heroes, his name became a banner for Viking courage. Ragnar's raids reached as far as Paris, and his conquests left kingdoms trembling. His story, sung around the fire, inspired generations to follow. Ragnar's sons were no less famous. Ivar the Boneless, perhaps crippled by disease or injury, became one of the most feared leaders of the Viking Age. His body may have been frail, but his mind was sharp and merciless. He commanded armies with strategy and cunning, proving that strength was not only of the body, but of the will. Beside him were his brothers, Bjorn Ironside, said to be invulnerable in battle, Ubi, steady and loyal, and Hvitserk, fierce and relentless. Together, they formed the core of the great heathen army that invaded England in the late 9th century. The great heathen army was no small raiding party. It was a host numbering in the thousands, drawn from Denmark, Norway, and beyond. In 865, they landed on English shores, not merely to raid, but to conquer. Kingdom after kingdom fell before them. Northumbria, once strong, was broken. East Anglia fell to their axes. Mercia bent beneath their power. Only Wessex, under the leadership of Alfred the Great, held its ground, fighting bitterly against the tide. Imagine the sight. An endless line of dragon-proud ships filling the horizon, sails taut with wind, oars flashing like wings. On the shore, warriors pour forth, shields gleaming, axes raised. Their war cries mingle with the thunder of drums. Villages burn, castles fall, and the English tremble as the great heathen army marches across their land. It was not only the violence of the raids, but the scale of the invasion that shocked Europe. Yet these leaders were not only destroyers, they were also builders of power. In England, the Danes carved out the Danelaw, regions governed by Norse law, where their customs, speech, and beliefs held sway. They minted coins, collected taxes, and enforced order. What began with Ragnar and his sons became a new form of rule, Viking kingship, born in blood, but tempered by governance. Across Scandinavia itself, kings were rising too. In Norway, Harald Fairhair sought to unite the scattered chieftains under one crown. Legend says he swore not to cut his hair until he had conquered all of Norway, earning his name. Through battle and alliance, he stitched together a kingdom where once there had been only clans. In Denmark and Sweden, two kings emerged, powerful rulers who extended their influence across seas and trade routes. These kings and warriors gave shape to what had once been chaos. The Vikings were no longer only fleeting shadows on the coast. They were armies, kingdoms, dynasties. Their leaders were not only raiders, but rulers, carving their names into the annals of history. But their power was not only in numbers or crowns, it was also in the myths woven around them. Ragnar's dragon-slaying, Ivar's ruthless brilliance, Harald's unshorn vow, these stories gave them an aura greater than mere men. To their enemies, They seemed larger than life, unstoppable forces sent by angry gods. To their followers, they were the embodiment of courage, destiny, and ambition. Even in death, their sagas lived on. Ragnar, captured by an English king, was said to have been thrown into a pit of serpents. There, as the venom took him, he sang a final song, boasting that his sons would avenge him. And so they did, their great heathen army sweeping England in fire and steel. Truth and legend blended as always, but the power of the tale mattered as much as the fact. As you close your eyes, imagine sitting in a smoky hall, firelight dancing on carved beams, as a skald recites the deeds of Ragnar and his sons. The hall falls silent, every ear bent toward the tale. Children dream of glory. Men grip their swords with renewed resolve. Women smile with pride for their kin. In these stories, the Vikings found not only entertainment, but identity. Their heroes reminded them of who they were and who they aspired to be. The kings and warriors of the Viking Age were the storm at the center of their world. They carried axes, yes, but also visions of power and order. They ruled not only with fear, but with charisma, binding men to them with loyalty and oaths. Through them, the scattered bands of the north became armies and kingdoms. Through them, the Vikings became more than raiders. They became rulers of destiny. The great heathen army had swept across England like a storm, tearing down kingdoms, toppling kings, and carving its name into the land. Yet conquest was never the end of the Viking story. For once the blood dried and the smoke cleared, the Norsemen did what they always did. They settled. They built homes, tilled fields, raised children, and made new lives. In England, this settling gave birth to something remarkable, a new domain where Viking laws and customs held sway. It was called the Danelaw, and it reshaped the island forever. By the mid-9th century, much of northern and eastern England had fallen under Viking control. Northumbria, once a proud kingdom, was shattered. Mercia, its power waning, submitted. East Anglia lay in ruins. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, long divided and often at odds with one another, now faced the reality of Norse rule. Only Wessex, under the determined leadership of Alfred the Great, remained a bastion of resistance. But while Alfred fought to preserve Anglo-Saxon independence, the Danes settled into their new lands. They divided the territory into 5 great centres: York, Lincoln, Derby, Stamford, and Leicester, each serving as a hub of power. From these bases, Viking jarls and kings enforced their will. They imposed their own laws, their own customs, their own sense of justice. To the people living there, life changed in ways subtle and profound. The laws of the Danelaw reflected Norse traditions. Justice was not a matter of written codes, but of assemblies, known as things, where free men gathered to decide disputes. Compensation, called vergild, was paid for injury or death, restoring balance rather than seeking punishment. Property was shared among heirs, women held more rights than in many other lands, and slavery, though present, was regulated by custom. It was a system familiar to the Norse, now transplanted into English soil. The influence of the Danelaw was not only legal but cultural. Old Norse words entered the English tongue, mingling with Anglo-Saxon. Words we use every day, sky, egg, window, knife, are echoes of the Viking presence. Place names, too, carried their mark. Villages ending in by, meaning farmstead, or thorp, outlying settlement, were Norse in origin. To travel across England today is to walk among the traces of the Danelaw in every name on the map. Imagine an English village in these years. The fields are worked by both Saxons and Norse, their languages blending into one another. At the market, silver coins stamped with Viking rulers are exchanged for grain and furs. In the Longhouse, Norse families tell sagas of Odin and Thor, while Saxon neighbors whisper prayers to Christ. The two cultures, once at war, now live side by side, uneasy but intertwined. Children grow up hearing both tongues, carrying in themselves the merging of two worlds. But the Danelaw was not simply a matter of peaceful settlement. It was also a land of shifting power, where Norse kings ruled with ambition. York, in particular, became a center of Viking authority. Kings like Halfdan Ragnarsson, one of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, and later rulers such as Eric Bloodaxe, sought to expand their influence, clashing with Anglo-Saxon lords and with one another. England was no longer a land of divided Saxon kingdoms, but a battlefield between Wessex and the Danelaw. It was Alfred the Great who stood against the tide. Though outnumbered, he used cunning to resist. He built fortified towns, called burhs, creating a network of defenses that could withstand sudden Viking raids. He reorganized his army, ensuring that while one part fought, another remained at home to guard the land. Through determination, he forced the Danes into treaties, drawing borders between Wessex and the Danelaw. For a time, a fragile balance held, the south under Saxon rule, the north and east under the Vikings. Yet the influence of the Danelaw could not be erased. Even after Wessex and its successors reconquered these lands, the imprint remained. The mingling of peoples, the blending of laws, the fusion of cultures had already reshaped England. Norse blood flowed in Saxon veins, Norse words filled Saxon speech, and Norse traditions shaped Saxon law. The Vikings had not only conquered land, they had altered identity. Think of the legacy of these years. A farmer ploughing his fields near York might use tools forged by Norse hands. A child in Lincoln might grow up with a Norse name but speak both tongues. A court in Leicester might settle disputes with laws drawn from both Saxon and Norse traditions. Life was no longer purely one or the other. It was something in between, something new. And in the sagas, too, the Danelaw lived on. The tales of Ragnar's sons, of Ivar the Boneless, and Bjorn Ironside, echoed through these lands. Norse remembered their victories, the Saxons their struggles, but together they created a shared history that could not be undone. As you drift into sleep, picture the English countryside in the 9th century. Villages with timber halls, smoke rising from chimneys, children laughing in meadows. In the distance, the towers of York rise above the city, markets alive with the chatter of many tongues. Along the roads, warriors pass, shields on their backs, watching the horizon. This is the Danelaw, neither wholly Norse nor wholly Saxon, but a realm born of conquest, settlement, and mingling. The Viking Age was no longer only raids and plunder. It was governance, settlement, and transformation. In England, the Danelaw showed how the Northmen had become more than shadows on the sea. They were rulers, lawmakers, neighbors. They had come not only to take but also to stay. The Viking ships had sailed west to raid monasteries and settle new lands, but the sea was not their only path. To the east, a different world awaited. A world of rivers that cut like silver threads through vast forests and endless plains, leading all the way to the riches of Byzantium and the caliphates. Here the Norsemen became known not as raiders, but as Varangians, traders, warriors, and rulers who left their mark upon the lands of the Slavs and beyond. From the Baltic Sea, the Vikings followed the great rivers southward. The Neva, the Volga, and the mighty Dnieper became their highways. Their shallow longships, as adept on rivers as on seas, glided over calm waters and rushed down rapids. When the rivers ran shallow, the ships could be dragged across the land, carried on shoulders or laid upon logs until they reached the next stretch of water. In this way, the Northmen moved deeper into the continent, reaching places no other seafarers could. At first they came as traders. From the forests they gathered furs, sable, fox, and beaver, prized in the markets of the south. From the north they brought walrus ivory and amber, glowing golden as sunlight. In return they sought silver coins, silks, wine, and spices. Along the rivers they built fortified camps and trading posts, places that grew into towns. One of these was Novgorod, a settlement that would become the first great city of the Rus. But the Varangians were more than merchants. They were warriors, and their strength allowed them to dominate the Slavic tribes through which they traveled. According to later chronicles, the Slavs even invited the Norse to rule over them, weary of endless quarrels and seeking order. Whether legend or truth, the result was clear. Norse chieftains became rulers in these lands. The most famous among them was Rurik, who established his dynasty in Novgorod around the mid-9th century. From his line would come the rulers of Kiev and, in time, the foundations of what we know as Russia. The Rus, as these Norse rulers and their subjects came to be known, turned their gaze further south. Along the Dnieper River, they sailed to Kiev, a city destined to become their capital. From there, their ships moved toward the Black Sea, and beyond it to Constantinople itself, the glittering heart of the Byzantine Empire. To the Byzantines, the Varangians were both threat and opportunity. Their first visits came as raiders, their longships swarming the coasts of the Bosporus, their warriors striking fear even in the mighty city of Constantinople. But the Byzantines, wise in diplomacy, turned their enemies into allies. They welcomed the Norse into their service, creating the famed Varangian Guard, an elite corps of warriors who served as the emperor's bodyguards. Tall, fierce, and loyal, these warriors stood watch in the great palaces, their axes gleaming in the light of golden mosaics. For the Norse, it was a path to wealth, honor, and adventure. Imagine a young Viking leaving his home in Sweden, sailing down the rivers, and entering the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople for the first time. He gazes upward at its vast dome, the walls shimmering with mosaics of saints and emperors. Incense fills the air, and Greek chants echo like thunder. For a man raised in wooden halls, this was a world of unimaginable splendor. To serve the Emperor of Byzantium was to touch greatness itself. The Varangians carried back more than silver and silks. They brought with them stories of distant lands, knowledge of new weapons and tactics, and a sense of the wider world. Christianity too flowed along these routes. In time, the rulers of the Ruses would convert, blending Norse traditions with Slavic and Christian ones, creating a culture both unique and enduring. But the eastward expansion was not only about Byzantium. Some Varangians pushed even further, reaching the Caspian Sea and trading with the Muslim caliphates. Arab writers recorded tales of tall, blonde traders who brought furs and slaves, exchanging them for silver dirhams. These coins, stamped with Arabic script, have been found in Viking graves across Scandinavia, proof of the vast networks the Norse had created. The Vikings who traveled eastward were different in spirit from those who raided the west. They were less about plunder and more about trade and rulership, yet they carried the same courage, the same adaptability. Where in England they left behind the Danelaw, in the east they left behind dynasties and cities that would last for centuries. Think now of the rivers at dusk. The forests rise dark on either side. The water glimmers in the fading light. A longship drifts silently, its oars pulling steady, its crew watching the horizon. Ahead lies a market, perhaps Kiev, where goods from east and west will mingle. Or perhaps beyond lies the Black Sea, its waters leading to the shining gates of Constantinople. The journey is long, but the Norse are undaunted. For them, every horizon is a promise. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the echo of axes in Constantinople's halls, the murmur of traders in Novgorod's markets, the rush of river rapids as ships are dragged across land. The Vikings had not only carved their names into Britain and Ireland, but also into the heart of the East. They had become Varangians, builders of trade, founders of dynasties, guardians of emperors. This was their genius, to adapt, to seize opportunity, to make foreign lands their own. From the fjords of Norway to the forests of Russia, from the monasteries of Lindisfarne to the palaces of Byzantium, their story spread like the wind, carrying with it both fear and fascination. The Viking Age was no longer confined to the cold seas of the north. It now stretched along rivers, across empires, into the very soul of Europe and beyond. The rivers of the east had carried the Vikings into Byzantium and the caliphates, but the call of the sea still tugged at their hearts. For the Norse, the horizon was never a barrier, it was an invitation. And so their ships turned westward once more into the wild waters of the North Atlantic, where they would discover new worlds and carve out fresh destinies at the very edge of the known earth. The journey began with Norway's restless sailors. The fjords were narrow, the land rocky and opportunities scarce. Ambitious chieftains and farmers looked across the sea, wondering what lay beyond. By the late 9th century they found their answer. Brave families set sail seeking new soil and landed upon a volcanic island, raw and untamed. Iceland. Iceland was unlike any land they had seen. Its black sands and steaming hot springs, its glaciers shining under the northern sun, its valleys filled with fertile pastures. It was harsh, yet rich, dangerous yet promising. The Norse claimed it eagerly. They built farms and halls, carved turf houses into the hills, and established a new society. But Iceland was more than a colony. It became a place of culture and law. Here in the year 930, the settlers founded the Althing, one of the world's oldest parliaments. On the plains of Thingvellir, chieftains and farmers gathered to recite laws, settle disputes, and make decisions for the whole island. Words carried as much weight as swords, and law became the backbone of this new Norse world. It was a society rooted not only in battle, but also in consensus and tradition. From Iceland, the Viking hunger for exploration pushed even further. To the northwest lay a vast ice-clad land, glimpsed in rumour, Greenland. It was here that Eric the Red, a fiery chieftain banished from Iceland for murder, sailed with his followers around the year 985. When he reached this new world, he gave it a name both bold and cunning, Greenland. Though much of it was ice and rock, Eric hoped the name would attract settlers. And indeed, it did. The Greenland settlements were hardy places. Families built farms in the fjords, where grass could grow in the short summers. They hunted seals, walrus, and caribou. They traded ivory, furs, and rope with Europe in exchange for iron and timber. Life was precarious, but it was life at the edge of the known world, and the Norse thrived there for centuries. Yet even Greenland was not the end. Beyond it, whispers told of another land, where wild grapes grew and forests stretched endlessly. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, set sail westward. His ship crossed icy seas and foggy horizons, until he reached the shores of a new continent, what we now know as North America. The Norse called it Vinland, the land of wine, for the wild grapes they found. Here were broad meadows, tall trees, and rivers rich with fish. Leif and his crew built a settlement, likely at what we now call Lanzo Meadows in Newfoundland. It was a fragile outpost, but it marked the first known European presence in the Americas, centuries before Columbus. Imagine the wonder of those sailors as they set foot on Vinland. They had sailed beyond the maps, past the edge of the known world, and discovered a land untouched by Europe. The forests whispered with mystery, the animals moved differently, the air itself felt new. For a brief time the Norse tasted this frontier, a glimpse of what lay beyond the horizon. Yet Vinland was not to be theirs. The Norse settlers faced resistance from the indigenous peoples, whom they called Skraelings. These encounters, often hostile, revealed that the land was not empty, but alive with its own peoples and cultures. The settlers also struggled with distance. Supply lines from Greenland were long, the winters harsh, and the numbers too few. After a few years, the Vinland colonies were abandoned, their dream receding back into saga and memory. Still, the Voyages left their mark. They showed the vast reach of the Viking spirit, from the fjords of Norway to the coasts of North America. The Norse had created a chain of settlements that spanned the Atlantic: Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland. Each was a stepping stone across the ocean, proof of their courage and their vision. Think of the courage it took to push into unknown waters, guided only by stars and sun, with no certainty of what lay ahead. To sail past icebergs, through storms, into horizons uncharted. To plant a home where no one you knew had ever stood before. These voyages were acts of faith in the sea, in their ships, and in themselves. As you drift towards sleep, imagine a longship rocking gently in the Atlantic swell. The stars wheel above, the northern lights shimmer across the sky. The crew sleeps beneath woolen cloaks, their dreams filled with visions of green valleys and endless forests. Ahead, the dark outline of a new land rises from the mist. It is Vinland, a promise just beyond reach. The Viking journey across the North Atlantic was not merely about conquest or plunder. It was about curiosity, endurance, and the yearning to know what lay beyond the horizon. In their ships, they carried not only weapons, but also seeds, animals, stories, and dreams. And in the lands they touched, from Iceland to America, they left echoes that endure to this day. The Vikings had become not just raiders, not just settlers, but explorers, discoverers of worlds both near and far. By the mid-9th century, The Vikings had struck deep into the British Isles, settled in Ireland, and carried their ships across the North Atlantic. But their hunger did not stop there. Their eyes turned south to the rich lands of Francia, the realm that had once been ruled by Charlemagne. Here the rivers wound like veins through fertile plains, carrying wealth from countryside to city, and none shone brighter than Paris, the jewel upon the Seine. The Franks had grown weary of the Viking raids. Since the first sudden attacks on monasteries and villages, their coasts and rivers had been plagued by dragon-prowed ships. Each summer, fleets would appear, their sails blotting the horizon, their warriors storming inland. They plundered towns, burned churches, and carried off treasure and captives. The Frankish kings often chose to buy peace, paying tribute known as Danegeld, silver handed over in exchange for a fragile promise to leave. But the payments only drew more raiders like moths to flame. In the year 845, the Vikings came for Paris itself. Their leader was said to be Ragnar Lothbrok, though whether it was he or another great chieftain, the chronicles speak of a host of ships sailing up the Seine. Imagine the sight: 120 long ships, sleek and deadly, gliding against the current, their prows carved with dragons and beasts, their shields glinting along the sides. The river carried them straight into the heart of Francia, past villages and abbeys that stood helpless before their might. The Franks gathered an army to resist. King Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, mustered his warriors and prepared to block the invaders. But the Vikings, cunning as always, struck with speed and ferocity. They cut through the Frankish defenses, capturing men, spreading fear, and pushing ever closer to Paris. The city's walls loomed, strong and defiant, yet vulnerable. On Easter Sunday of that year, the Viking host arrived before Paris. Bells rang in alarm, priests prayed for deliverance, and the citizens watched in dread as the dragon ships surrounded their city. Siege engines were raised, bridges attacked, and flames lit the sky. For days the Norse warriors pressed their assault, their axes and spears clashing against the defenses, their war cries echoing across the river. But Paris held. Its walls, stout and well-manned, resisted the storm. The Franks, though shaken, fought with desperation, and so the siege dragged on, neither side able to deliver a final blow. At last King Charles chose the path of his predecessors. He offered tribute, 7,000 pounds of silver, a ransom to buy peace. The Vikings accepted, loading their ships with glittering wealth. With their sails full of treasure and their bellies full of triumph, they turned back down the Seine, leaving Paris smouldering but unconquered. The Frankish annals record this with both shame and awe. To pay such a price was humiliating, yet it was also proof of the Vikings' power. They had reached the heart of the kingdom, faced its king and forced him to yield. For the Norse it was a victory greater than gold. It was a statement that no city, no river, no king was beyond their reach. But this was not the last time Paris would feel the shadow of dragon-prowed ships. In 885, a far greater siege came. This time, a massive Viking army, perhaps thousands strong, sailed up the Seine. Their leaders, Siegfried and Rollo, demanded tribute. When refused, they besieged Paris once more. For a year, the city endured, its defenders clinging to hope as famine and disease ravaged the attackers. Eventually, peace was bought again, and the Vikings sailed away, though not without carving scars upon the city's memory. The story of Paris shows both the strength and weakness of the Viking Age. On the one hand, the Norse could penetrate deep into the heart of Europe, defying kings and threatening capitals. On the other, they rarely held such conquests. Their power lay in speed and shock, in seizing treasure and terror, not in ruling great cities. And yet, even in their failure to conquer Paris, they shaped the destiny of France. For out of these raids came something unexpected: settlement. Some Viking leaders, like Rollo, realized that endless raiding could never bring lasting power. Instead, they sought to rule land, to plant roots as they had in England and Ireland. In time, Rollo would be granted lands in northern France, the region that became Normandy, named for the Norsemen themselves. From there, his descendants would become dukes, kings, and conquerors, carrying Viking blood into the very veins of Europe. Picture the Seine in those days. Its waters reflect the fire of burning villages, The cries of the frightened mix with the clash of steel. Above it all, the towers of Paris rise, steadfast, a beacon of defiance. On the river longships drift, their warriors fierce yet weary, their ambitions reaching ever higher. It was a moment when the fate of a kingdom trembled, and the Norse carved their name into the chronicles of the Franks. As you fall deeper into sleep, imagine yourself standing on the walls of Paris watching the dragon ships approach. The river is alive with oars, the sails billow like storm clouds, and the air hums with the sound of drums. Fear grips the city, yet within it beats the unyielding heart of resistance. For though the Vikings came with fire and steel, Paris endured, and in enduring, it shaped the future of both the Franks and the Norse. The siege of Paris was not only a battle of men and walls, it was a turning point, a reminder that the Vikings were more than fleeting raiders. They were forces of destiny, reshaping kingdoms, forging new realms, and planting seeds that would grow long after their sails had vanished from the horizon. The Viking Age had begun with swift raids, the sudden terror of dragon-proud ships on unknown shores. But by the late 9th and early 10th centuries, something was shifting. The Norse realized that treasure and tribute, though dazzling, were fleeting. To endure, they needed land, roots, and crowns. And so the raiders became rulers, planting themselves in the very kingdoms they once terrorized. Nowhere was this transformation clearer than in Normandy, the land of the Northmen. The story begins with the Great Siege of Paris in 885-886. Among the Viking leaders who besieged the city was a chieftain named Rollo. Tall, broad, and fierce, he commanded both respect and fear. Though the siege ended with failure, Rollo's ambitions were not quenched. He continued to raid along the Seine, pressing deeper into Francia, threatening towns and fields alike. The Franks, weary of endless war, sought a solution. In 911, King Charles the Simple offered Rollo a pact. The Viking leader would be granted lands in the lower Seine Valley, fertile fields, rich rivers, and the city of Rouen if he agreed to defend them against other raiders and to accept baptism as a Christian. Rollo accepted. In this treaty, the raider became a count, the outsider a ruler. The land became known as Normandy, the realm of the Northmen. Here the Norse settled in earnest. They built farms, markets, and towns. They mingled with the local Franks, intermarrying, blending their language and customs. Within a few generations, they were no longer purely Viking, but neither were they purely Frankish. They became something new, Normans, a people shaped by both sea and soil, both axe and cross. In Normandy, the transformation of the Vikings reached its height. These descendants of raiders did not forget their warrior roots, but they wrapped them in the garb of lords and knights. They built castles of stone, donned chainmail, and embraced the feudal order of medieval Europe. Their longships gave way to horses, their raids to campaigns of conquest, yet the fire of their ancestors still burned in their blood. Imagine Rouen in those years. Once a Frankish town, now alive with Norse energy. The streets are filled with merchants, the markets with goods from across the seas. Priests chant in stone churches, even as Old Norse words echo in the halls. A Norman knight rides past, his armor gleaming, his banner fluttering, the descendant of men who once stood on the prows of dragon ships. It is a world where past and present blend, forging a new identity. The Normans did not remain confined to their duchy. Their ambition carried them outward. In the 11th century, one of their most famous sons rose to prominence, William, Duke of Normandy. Known to history as William the Conqueror, he carried the Viking legacy across the English Channel. In 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, his knights crushed the Anglo-Saxon army of Harold Godwinson. England fell into Norman hands, and the Norse bloodline, through Normandy, came to rule a new kingdom. Think of the irony. The Vikings, who had once raided England's coasts with fire and fear, now returned as kings. The Danelaw had faded, but the Norman conquest ensured that Norse influence would endure in England's very crown. The language, the laws, the architecture, all were reshaped by Norman hands, carrying forward echoes of the Viking Age. But Normandy was not the only place where Norse settlers became rulers. Across the seas, in Ireland, the Norse Gaels founded kingdoms of their own. Dublin, once a Viking fortress, grew into a thriving city, ruled by Norse dynasties who married into Gaelic families. The Kingdom of Dublin became a centre of trade and power, bridging Scandinavia and Ireland. In the north of England, Norse earls held sway in York. In Scotland, the islands of Orkney, Shetland and the Hebrides became Norse domains, ruled by jarls who answered to kings across the sea. Even in faraway Sicily and southern Italy, Norman adventurers, descendants of Viking settlers, carved out kingdoms blending Norse boldness with Mediterranean ambition. Everywhere they went, the Norse showed the same gift: adaptability. They became knights in France, kings in England, lords in Ireland, and princes in Sicily. They embraced new faiths, new languages, and new customs, but they never forgot the courage of their ancestors. Their axes had become swords, their halls castles, their sagas chronicles. The spirit of the Viking lived on, reshaped but unbroken. As you drift towards sleep, picture a great hall in Normandy. Tapestries hang upon the walls, telling stories of both Thor and Christ, of longships and castles. At the high table sits a Norman duke, his sword at his side, his words commanding knights and priests alike, yet in his eyes glimmers the same restless fire that once drove his forefathers to the sea. The transformation of the Vikings into rulers shows the arc of their age. They began as shadows on the horizon, feared and hated. They ended as kings and dukes, their blood flowing in the veins of Europe's nobility. From Normandy to England, from Ireland to Sicily, their legacy was no longer only of raids but of realms, no longer only of plunder but of permanence. The Viking Age was nearing its twilight, but its light had not dimmed. It had merely changed, shining now from crowns instead of sails, from thrones instead of longships. The raiders had become rulers, and their story was far from over. For centuries the Vikings had called upon the old gods, Odin the All-Father, Thor with his hammer, Freya of love and war, and Loki the trickster. Their sagas were filled with Valhalla's glory, where the brave dead feasted forever. Their ships carried sacrifices to the sea, and their halls echoed with oaths sworn on sacred rings. Yet as the 10th and 11th centuries unfolded, the old ways began to fade. A new faith, the faith of the Christians, spread across the Norse world. With it came churches instead of temples, priests instead of schools, and a transformation that reached to the very heart of Viking identity. The change did not happen overnight. Christianity had touched the Norse world long before their official conversions. From the earliest raids on monasteries, the Vikings encountered this new religion. Some mocked it, others feared it, and still others saw its power. Captured monks became scribes in Viking courts, and treasures looted from churches found places of honor in Norse halls. The seeds of change had been planted even in the days of plunder. Trade deepened the connection. As Viking merchants sailed to Francia, to the German lands, to Byzantium, they encountered Christian rulers again and again. To deal in these markets, to gain favor at foreign courts, it was useful to show respect for Christ. Many Norse chieftains allowed missionaries into their lands, not out of piety, but out of pragmatism. Slowly the cross appeared alongside the hammer, not yet replacing it, but standing beside it. One of the first great conversions came in Denmark. In the 10th century, King Harald Bluetooth declared himself a Christian and raised a great stone at Jelling to proclaim it. King Harald won all of Denmark and Norway, the runes say, and made the Danes Christian. His motives were not only spiritual. By embracing the faith, Harald tied Denmark into the powerful Christian world of Europe, strengthening his rule and his alliances. In Norway, the struggle was fiercer. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Saint Olaf Haraldsson spread Christianity by sword as much as sermon. Temples to Thor and Odin were torn down, churches razed in their place. Those who resisted were punished, sometimes with exile, sometimes with death. Yet many embraced the new faith, seeing in it not only salvation but also power, unity, and connection to the wider world. By the mid-11th century, Norway too had become a Christian kingdom. Sweden resisted longest, its deep forests still echoing with sacrifices to the old gods. At Uppsala, a great temple stood, its pillars dripping with blood from ritual offerings. But even here, change came. By the late 11th century, Christianity had triumphed, and the old temple fell silent. The conversion of Iceland is one of the most remarkable stories of this age. In the year 1000, the Althing, Iceland's great parliament, faced division. Some chieftains clung to the old gods, others embraced the new. To prevent civil war, they made a decision unlike any other. The whole island would convert together. The lawgiver Thorgir lay beneath his cloak for a day and a night in silent thought. When he rose, he declared that Iceland would become Christian, though private worship of the old gods could continue for a time. It was a compromise, a peaceful turning point in a violent age. Christianity reshaped the Norse world in countless ways. Churches rose where once stood temples, their bells ringing across valleys that had long echoed with skald songs. Written records multiplied, for Christian monks recorded the sagas and laws in ink upon parchment, preserving them for future ages. The runestones, once carved to honor pagan gods, now bore crosses. The image of Christ began to appear alongside ships, warriors, and dragons, yet the old ways did not vanish entirely. The memory of Odin and Thor, of Freyja and Loki, lingered in the sagas, whispered in folk tales, and woven into the language itself. Even as the people prayed to Christ, they remembered the myths of their ancestors. In truth, the Norse did not wholly abandon their past. They transformed it, blending the old with the new. Think now of a village in this time of change. A wooden church stands where once a shrine had been. Inside, candles flicker on an altar, and a priest chants in Latin. Outside, children play, some bearing names drawn from saints, others from sagas. At night, families gather by the fire. They listen to tales of Thor's hammer, but also to the story of Christ on the cross. Two worlds, side by side, weaving into one. The rise of Christianity brought the Norse into the heart of medieval Europe. They were no longer outsiders, raiders beyond the pale. They were now part of the Christian kingdoms, bound by the same faith, part of the same story. This opened doors for trade, for diplomacy, for marriage into royal houses. But it also marked the twilight of the Viking age, for without the old gods, without the fierce independence of pagan halls, the identity of the Viking began to fade. As you drift deeper into sleep, picture a great stone standing in a field. Carved upon it are runes, but also a cross. The sun sets behind it, casting long shadows across the grass. In that stone is the story of a people warriors who once called upon Odin, now kneeling before Christ, yet never forgetting their past. The conversion of the Norse was not only a religious change, it was the transformation of an age. From the fires of Thor's hammer to the light of Christ's cross, the Vikings stepped into a new world. Their sails still caught the wind, their swords still gleamed, but their destiny now lay not only in raids and conquests, but in the shared faith of Europe. The Vikings had carved their names across the seas, from the fjords of Norway to the rivers of Russia, from the shores of Ireland to the walls of Constantinople. For centuries, their sails filled the horizon, their axes struck terror, their ships carried both plunder and dreams, yet no age lasts forever. By the late 11th century, the Viking Age was drawing to its close. The twilight had come, not in sudden ruin, but in a slow transformation as the world changed around them and within them. Several forces brought this twilight. The first was Christianity. With the spread of the new faith, the Norse world was drawn into the larger fabric of medieval Europe. No longer outsiders, the once pagan warriors became part of Christendom. They built churches, minted coins with crosses, and obeyed bishops and kings. The fiery independence of the old sagas softened beneath the weight of Christian law and feudal order. The hammer of Thor gave way to the cross of Christ, and with it, the identity of the Viking shifted. Another was the rise of stronger kingdoms across Europe. In the early days, the Vikings had thrived because their enemies were divided. The Anglo-Saxons fought each other, the Franks were fractured, the Irish ruled by rival clans. But by the 10th and 11th centuries, kings had grown more powerful. England unified under the House of Wessex. France began to consolidate its crown. Even the German lands grew stronger under the Holy Roman Empire. Fortresses were built along rivers, armies better organized, and tribute less easily bought. The element of surprise, once the Vikings' greatest weapon, began to vanish. A third reason was the transformation of the Vikings themselves. Once content with plunder, they now sought permanence. Settlements in Ireland, England and Normandy became cities and duchies. Normandy's dukes became kings of England. The Norse Gaels became lords of Ireland. The Varangians became princes of Kiev. The raiders had become rulers, and in ruling they no longer needed to raid. The dragon ships were replaced by castles, the warbands by courts. The last great Viking invasion of England came in 1066, when King Harald Hardrada of Norway, a man called the Thunderbolt of the North, sought to claim the English throne. His fleet sailed with the ambition of reviving the glory of his ancestors. But at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, he met defeat at the hands of Harold Godwinson, the English king. Harald Hardrada fell in battle, struck down by an arrow, and with him died the dream of a new Viking conquest of England. Just 3 weeks later, another battle would change history again, the Norman conquest, when William the Conqueror, himself of Viking blood, defeated Harold at Hastings. The irony was clear. The Vikings had failed to conquer England with axes, but their descendants in Normandy succeeded with knights and horses. In Scandinavia itself, the twilight deepened. The kingdoms of Denmark, Norway and Sweden consolidated, embracing Christianity and feudal order. Kings sought to build stable monarchies rather than lead raiding fleets. The old culture of jarls and sea kings gave way to centralized power, law codes and parliaments. The skalds still sang, but their voices now praised Christian kings instead of pagan heroes. Yet even in twilight, the Viking spirit did not vanish. In the east, the Varangians still served in Byzantium, their axes guarding the emperor's throne. In the west, Norse bloodlines ruled in Normandy and England, carrying forward the legacy of their ancestors. In Iceland, the sagas were written down, preserving the memory of Odin and Thor, of Ragnar and Eric, of voyages to Vinland. The Viking Age had ended, but its story lived on. Imagine for a moment the last Viking fleet setting sail. The ships are fewer now, the sails less proud, the warriors fewer in number. They no longer strike with the confidence of old, for they know the world has changed. On the horizon lie stronger kingdoms, fortified towns and armies ready to meet them. Yet still they go for the sea calls, and the memory of their fathers drives them forward. The waves crash, the oars dip, the wind fills the sail. It is the twilight of an age, but not the death of a people. As you drift towards sleep, picture the fjords at dusk. The waters glisten in the fading light, the mountains rise dark against the sky. In the harbor, a single longship rests, its dragon prow carved but weathered, its timbers old but proud. The voices of the past seem to whisper on the wind, the laughter of raiders, the cries of battle, the songs of skalds. They fade into the night, but they are never gone. For the Vikings did not disappear. They became part of Europe, their blood mingling with kings and peasants alike, their words lingering in languages, their stories shaping imaginations. Their twilight was not an end, but a transformation. The Viking Age had risen in fire and storm, and now it set in the calm of crowns and crosses. From raiders to rulers, from pagans to Christians, from longships to kingdoms, the Norse had completed their journey. Their saga was finished, yet it still echoes even now in every place their sails once touched. The longships no longer glide across Europe's rivers. Their dragon prows no longer darken the seas, nor do their sails strike terror on distant shores. The Viking Age is gone, its twilight faded into history. Yet the legacy of the Vikings endures, not as fleeting raids, but as roots sunk deep into the soil of our world. Their story did not end with their last battles. It lives on in language, in law, in culture, in the very shape of nations. One of the greatest legacies of the Vikings lies in language. The mingling of Norse and Anglo-Saxon in the Danelaw transformed English forever. Everyday words, sky, egg, knife, window, husband, are gifts of the Norse tongue. Even the simple pronouns they, them and their came from Old Norse, reshaping English grammar itself. When you speak English today, you carry echoes of Viking voices, as if their ships still linger upon the horizon of our speech. Their influence endures in law and governance too. In Iceland, the Althing became one of the earliest parliaments, a gathering of free men to decide disputes and laws. This tradition of collective governance, born in the windswept plains of Thingvellir, prefigured systems of democracy that would spread across the world. In England, the Danelaws' customs blended with Saxon ones, creating a legal fabric that would shape the kingdom for centuries. The Vikings were not only raiders, they were lawmakers, leaving behind codes of justice as well as scars of war. Their legacy shines in exploration. The Norse were the first Europeans to cross the Atlantic, reaching Greenland and Vinland centuries before Columbus. Though their settlements did not endure, the memory of their voyages lingered in sagas and maps, a reminder of humanity's restless hunger for horizons. The courage it took to sail into the unknown, guided only by stars, speaks across the ages to every explorer who dares the edge of the map. Their spirit of adaptation also shaped history. Where once they came as raiders, they became rulers. In Normandy, they transformed into dukes and knights, eventually crossing the Channel as conquerors of England. In Sicily, their descendants became kings, blending Norse boldness with Mediterranean grandeur. In Russia, they became princes of Kiev, founders of dynasties that would influence Eastern Europe for centuries. The Vikings did not vanish. They became part of the very kingdoms they once threatened. Even in faith, their legacy remains complex. Though they embraced Christianity, their old gods linger in memory. The days of our week still carry their names. Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Thursday for Thor, Friday for Freya. In every calendar, the gods of the North live quietly, reminders of a mythology that still captivates imaginations. Their sagas, preserved in Iceland, tell of gods and heroes, of dragons and journeys, of courage and fate. These stories, written in the language of skalds, echo in modern literature, art and film, a testament to their enduring power. And then there is their cultural influence. The Vikings left behind more than artifacts of war. Their jewelry, carved with intricate knotwork, still inspires artists. Their shipbuilding, sleek and efficient, was a marvel of engineering. Their runestones stand in fields across Scandinavia, carved with names and deeds, immortalizing lives long gone. Their art, their poetry, their very worldview, shaped by sea and saga, continue to fascinate us. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Vikings is found in the imagination. For centuries, they have been remembered both as brutal raiders and as noble explorers. Fear and admiration mingle in their memory. To some, they are destroyers of monasteries, to others, discoverers of new worlds. In truth, they were both, flawed and fierce, creative and cruel, human in all their contradictions, and in that humanity lies their timelessness. Picture now the wide world they touched. The Seine in France, where their ships once glided beneath Paris, the green fields of England, where their laws blended with Saxon ones, the fjords of Norway, where their kings swore oaths to the old gods, the icy coasts of Greenland, where Eric the Red built his farms, the forests of Russia, where the Varangians ruled as princes, the palaces of Byzantium, where Norse warriors guarded emperors with their shining axes, and the shores of Vinland, where Leif Erikson glimpsed a new continent. Their story spanned a world, and so too does their legacy. As you drift into sleep, imagine standing on a quiet northern shore. The sea is calm, the sky painted with the glow of the northern lights. The long ships are gone, their sails folded forever, but their memory lingers in the whisper of the waves. You hear echoes, the songs of skalds, the clash of battle, the laughter of children in distant settlements. The past has faded, but its spirit remains. The Viking Age was a chapter in the great story of humanity, one of daring and change, of destruction and creation. Its twilight came, but its legacy endures, flowing like a hidden current beneath the surface of our world. When you hear the word sky, when you walk through a town ending in By or Thorpe, when you marvel at tales of Odin or Thor, you are touching that legacy. And so as the stars wheel overhead, remember that the Vikings are not truly gone. Their ships may rest, their gods may sleep, but their story still sails across time, across culture, across the imagination of every generation. Their saga is ours now, carried forward not in longships but in memory. The age of the Vikings has ended. The age of their legacy has never ceased.